Testing. Okay. So, first of all, thanks for coming. I'm going to go through and sort of, for those who don't know, Digital Eclipse, what Digital Eclipse is, what we sort of do, who I am, and sort of what our, we're a studio that sort of tries to help with game preservation in a lot of ways, and we do it in a variety of ways, but the newest initiative that we're doing I'm going to talk about today. So, so who am I? I'm this guy right here in the arrow. So this is Mike's office, who's our studio head, and you can see that he's a big collector of stuff. We are, a pretty passionate studio. I head the production, so basically I help manage the development teams that we have at Digital Eclipse. And I've been there for about 7 years now. And I've worked at a lot of companies. I worked at EA and Activision and Sega. I worked for Sega for almost a decade, working on Sonic in the last few years of that, for 2 or 3 years. So it was interesting to see the Sonic people here, actually. It was before I came in on the Roger Craig Smith era after them, but it was still cool to work on Sonic. So Digital Eclipse, what are we? This is a photo from our arcade. We're very much fans of classic games and arcade games. We've been around since '92, and we're based in Emeryville, California, just down the road from Pixar. And we've been there for a fair bit, and we were sort of the first company to release actually emulation in a retail product. And so we emulated some arcade games back in the day, Williams arcade games in the early days, before anyone understood or even knew what emulation was. And we've kind of grown and expanded. We're developers, but we also publish our own stuff. So what do we do? Predominantly, we're known for our emulation-based collections. We also do remakes and remasters. We do demakes where someone will come and say, like, we've got this modern gen game. Can you distill it down to like a 16-bit sort of game for fun? And then we also do original games that are kind of harken back to that era of 16-bit or arcades, early arcades, where it's very easy to pick up and play, pixel art, very, very clean sort of experience. These are some of the things that we've sort of released. My first project, Digital Eclipse, was the Street Fighter collection, and we've gone through and done a lot of stuff over the years. This is just a small sampling of it. Atari 50 was one that really blew up for us because it is a kind of a different approach to video games. It is actually more of an interactive documentary, and we kind of, if you haven't played it, it's presented in sort of this timeline where you can go through and scroll through the history of Atari and also jump to any of the games we talk about them and play them, and then jump back. So it's very seamless, digestible sort of presentation, and it won us a lot of awards and acclaim because it was such a very different approach to video games, and we're sort of continuing that, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So Gold Master Series is this new initiative that we're doing. We've always been fans, obviously, as I've said before, of preservation of games, and also not only that, but also kind of spotlighting on developers and studios and games that help to be the foundation of the video game industry today, right? And had an influence on the things that games are today. So this is our sort of logo. We've released sort of the first one, and what it is it's a numbered series of games, and it's meant to basically, like I said, spotlight and be a more intimate kind of exploration of developers and games and studios. And we go in and we dive deep into sort of providing historical context and working with those developers in order to tell their story in a sort of digestible, interactive timeline format. So the first one was the making of Karateka or Karateka or Karateka. Depends on how you say it. Many people say it different ways, and even there's a joke in this release where there's a video about how people pronounce this, and they're either all wrong or all right, but it's very hilarious. But it's the first one, so it's a story of Jordan Mechner and his journey as a child or younger man in college who had dreams of creating video games and sort of doing that, and his father who was sort of torn between I need you to have a college education, but I want to support you doing this. And so we portray sort of the story from early on about Jordan and how he tried to start making games and kept failing and failing. It's a very human story, and how his father's kept encouraging. And we actually went when we released this and filmed them today and their interactions together. So it's a very touching, relatable story, especially if anyone who's trying to get into the games industry or trying to succeed in something, right? So when we create these, what's our goal? Oftentimes, as you might know, a lot of video games disappear, and the history of video games keeps disappearing all the time because in the early generations, most people didn't care about preserving this stuff or logging it away or anything. So a lot of stuff has gone missing and keeps missing, right? And you have this situation with like movies where every time there's a new technology, movies get re-released. You know, every Casablanca's going to be re-released, Godfather's going to be released, but video games aren't like that. They kind of get released once or twice and then they kind of disappear. And the generations that sort of come after that can't really learn from those games or enjoy those games because they're very difficult to get. So what we like to do is kind of go back in time and explore the creators and the games that we grew up with that we felt made a monumental difference in this industry, and then focus on that, right? So how do we do this? So we go and obviously we work very closely with the people that we are including in these games and these releases. So Jordan Mechner and his dad, and like I said, we went and interviewed them and talked to them a lot. And we grab all of the content. Fortunately, Jordan actually wrote a journal every day pretty much during his early years. And so even to this day, he actually writes in a journal about what's going on in his daily life and what he's working on and things like that. So we had a lot of content to work with, and you can actually see this great progression, and we can tell this story of things. So like, you know, the very first game that or prototype that he did, you can see and play it, and then you can see the letter that he sent it out to companies to see if there was interest, and he would get letters back, and they'd say, well, this is an interesting game, but we probably need you to do A, B, C, and D. And so he does it, and then he makes another prototype, and then you can play that prototype, and then he sends it out, and then he gets another letter. So you can actually see this organic growth of him and how he is reacting to people giving him feedback, and you can kind of see his growth as a designer and a video game developer. And it's a very interesting learning experience. We came to sort of this epiphany of how we put this stuff together by, you know, you see a lot of video game documentaries on Netflix or TV or Amazon, but it's strange that video game documentaries are non-interactive, and so we came up with this whole concept of like, well, they should be interactive. The best way to tell the history of games is as a game. And so that's where this whole idea kind of came from. So it's really an interactive documentary with very digestible entry points, and you can play all the games, and you can do whatever order you want them in. Like when you go into a museum, you're going to a dinosaur exhibit, you walk into the room and there's like maybe like a video playing about dinosaurs. There's maybe like some placards with text information. There's maybe like some artwork or photos and things like that. But you can decide what you want to look at. You're not forced down a particular path. And so that's how we address it in these collections too. Very easy to jump around, very quick, and you can choose the order in which you learn about these things. So this is, if you've never seen it, this is sort of like what our timelines look like. This is ironically a fan letter from George Romero in his early days, before I think he might have just founded id Software and was working on Doom and Wolfenstein 3D. But he was a huge fan of Jordan. So like things like this that we're able to find and scan and provide in these collections adds a lot of context to that. So you can kind of go through the history here and see all the different sort of things that inspired Jordan or impacted him as well, and learn that story organically through images, videos, and things like that. Obviously, like I said before, I was hinting at this. So like Death Bounce was his first prototype. It was before Karateka or even what would lead to Prince of Persia, right? Which is the game that most people know him for, is Prince of Persia and the Prince of Persia series. So Death Bounce back in 1982 was his first prototype. And then he obviously progressed on, and we have all the prototypes that he did based off that. So you can, you know, as a game designer or someone who's interested in game history, you can actually go through and play each of these and understand the differences and the nuances of them, and then kind of see where his journey went. Again, I hint at being interactive. So it may seem a little bit silly, but even something as like us scanning and 3D modeling the floppy disks, you can rotate this and zoom in and look at it. And it may be a bit silly, but it's sort of a way that we preserve the history of this, right? Like, you know, floppies degrade, they disappear. And, you know, being able to see that in a physical sense adds sort of a realistic nature to it all, right? And so, we do this for the cartridges, game cartridges like an Atari, or the arcade cabinets, and things like that, and adds a little layer of like realism, like it feels like it's a legit thing versus just a 2D item on an image, right? So we want everything to be interactive. We want to educate in fun ways. So, in Karateka, the big thing about Karateka, what made it so defining and innovative is that it used rotoscoping. So basically, he would film him and his dad running and doing animations for the game. And then he would take that 8mm footage and then he would draw over it frame by frame. And it was very painstaking, but that's what made Karateka such a revolutionary game at the time, because it felt like a motion picture. The animations were very smooth and lifelike. The way that characters moved in general was very impressive. So what we've done to make things fun is that you can actually go through and watch the original videos, and you can turn off and on the layers so you can see how he drew over each frame and the amount of time it took. So you can understand how that process went and how he ended up with the characters that he did in the game. So generally with these products, we learn a lot because we've talked to the developers, we've done a ton of research, we scoured the world for documents, and we kind of like just spend months and months and months in this world. And we learn a lot. We learn about things that the developers wish they could have had in the games. We learn about what the limitations they had with hardware and things like that. And so what we like to do with each of these sort of releases is that we take everything that we've learned and then we create a new version of the game that sort of harkens back to sort of the limitations that they might have had, but fixes potentially a lot of the problems that they couldn't overcome or the limitations that they couldn't overcome. So this is our remastered of Karateka that you can play in the collection as well. So you can kind of go through history, and it ends with this. And you can kind of see the natural evolution of like, if Jordan Mechner were to create a new version of the game today, what would it be like? So that's sort of like us learning from the original developers and then applying that into a new version of the game. So, in the end, our goals are to sort of help with video game preservation by making classic and important games more accessible to everybody so that you can play them on modern systems. And the engine that we use and the systems that we use allow us to continually release it if we want to or if the publishers want to, right? So we make that very easy. We add features to games to make them more accessible. So things like if a game ran really slowly on a particular hardware, or it had certain audio limitations due to the hardware, things like that, we kind of think about what was the actual intention of the developer, and then we work on that to improve it. And we always make it optional. So you can always play our games in the exact way that they were originally released, but you can also turn off various and on various things that would allow you to enjoy them more in the expectations of modern audiences. Like for some of our collections, we had rewind, right? So if you fall down, you can rewind, or save anywhere, right? Because in these games, you couldn't save everywhere. So you can save anytime you want to. In fact, we even did things like traditionally, some of these games of the versions of Karateka only had like 2 or 3 buttons for attacks, 2 buttons for attacks. But they have 3 levels. They have high, medium, and low. And so what we did is made an optional setting to use 6 buttons like Street Fighter. And so you can actually play it high, medium, and low. It makes the game a lot more intuitive and enjoyable. So we add features. Again, provide behind-the-scenes content. This goes across all of our releases. We spend a ton of time traveling the world and digging through archives and vaults and marketing folks and things like that to try to get things that didn't exist. Our Turtles, our Cowabunga collection, we went to this secret Konami vault and dug out like thousands of pages of documents that had never been seen before, and scanned them all in and translated them. So it's very time-intensive work, but we do it so that for future generations, they can sort of look at this stuff and learn from it. In fact, Cowabunga collection is a great example because there was so much behind-the-scenes content in that we actually built and added in a search engine in that game so that you can search, like if you want to know how many times the turtle blimp appears on a piece of artwork or in marketing materials for Turtles, you can actually put that in there and we'll show you all of it. So it's less, from a consumer perspective, most people probably don't really care about that. But if you imagine in 5 or 10 years, someone who's a researcher who's doing a story or history about Turtles could pull that off the shelf and learn a lot from it and talk about it, right? And then the fourth thing is that, we want to put a spotlight on these developers and companies that made a huge impact on this industry and who current generation of gamers may not know about. And they, and despite not knowing about them, we want people to understand where these ideas and these concepts came from and where the foundations of this industry were created, right? So to share their story is really, really important to us because in most cases, it's a very, very relatable and human story and oftentimes very emotional as well. So what's next for us? We just announced the second volume of this collection, which is Jeff Minter. Jeff Minter is a very eclectic developer. He is a British developer who's developed stuff for the Z computers and early. He's done stuff for Jaguar, and he's very interested in like obscure hardware. The Nuon, if you're familiar with the Nuon, he did a thing. But he's very much about like psychedelic and sort of trippy games. He uses a lot of like llamas and camels in his stuff, which is why his company's called LlamaSoft. But he has this very passionate user base, and he's a very genuine and very sweet guy. And he's still the longest independent developer in history. He still is right now developing games for Atari after all of this time. So he's never given it up. He does what he likes. He was sort of put on the map by doing a lot of these music visualizers, and it's baked up into a lot of things. Like there's one in the Jaguar CD, there's one in the Xbox 360. That when you play music CDs, you get this virtualizer stuff, and he's created a number of those. And so what's challenging about this project is that all of his stuff is on generally defunct hardware or early PC stuff, or console hardware that never got released. Like, for example, we include a prototype of one of his games for the Connex multi-system, which is a system that's never released publicly, but we managed to emulate it, and we included it in there. And it's important that we do that because it helps to tell the story of like, where his journey was going and things like that. And it also educates people like, I didn't know the Connex multi-system was a thing, but, and that's the ironic thing. When we announced this, that was the number one. People love Jeff Minter, but everyone freaked out about the Connex multi-system because I'm like, I don't understand how they have this because it doesn't exist really. So it's telling his story and kind of going through his life and putting spotlight on him because he does have a very loyal sort of fan base, but mostly in the UK and Europe and less in the United States. So bringing attention to him and sort of the games that he's done and the impact that he's made was really important to us. So that's the second one in our series that is coming out next year. And that's sort of it. I leave it up to any questions if you guys want to ask anything about Digital Eclipse or sort of what we do. Obviously, this is just one initiative that we do in relation to preservation. We work with a lot of groups, but we also continue our trend of doing traditional collections and also original games, that are designed in that style, old school style, and things like that. So, but yeah, thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah. Yeah, so the ROM sort of like, Internet Archive has a hosting of a lot of ROMs and RIPs and stuff like complete sets of stuff. And obviously that's sort of important. But we've gotten to a point where like the actual game itself is becoming less important. There are a lot of missing games still, but really it's easy enough to do that and to rip stuff. What we kind of focus on and what Archive does, and it's a very involved work, is to provide the context and historical significance of those games. Some people are doing like the Video Game History Foundation, who's also in our office. They focus more on like what were reviews like, what were the marketing materials like, and things like that, right? That tell the story of the time that a game got released. So ROM preservation is definitely important, and that job should continue. But the challenge is that like to play a game 20 or 30 years from now without any sort of context to it, you're like, I don't know if this game is important or not. Like, should I care about it? So what we try to focus on to build upon that is to, in all of our collections, is to explain why the things that we include are important and why you should care. And then we also tell the story of like what's going on in the world at the time, what's going on at the company at the time, and the people involved in those projects, so that when you read it and you learn from it, you're like, okay, I might not have cared about this game before, but now I understand its significance in the great scheme of things, and now I care and invested a little bit more, right? So that's our direction, right? So we definitely want games to be accessible to everyone and continue to be accessible, and that's why we build the hardware that way and our emulation hardware that way. But we also very much feel that it is a key important thing, and this is what takes up a lot of time, is to go and scour for content that provides that background story, right? So, yeah. Any questions? Oh, you go ahead. Yeah.
So I know
Yeah, so certainly there's always interest in a lot of that stuff, but that's still relatively modern era, right? You know, you're talking 16-bit era and so forth, and you know, that has a lot of content that goes along with it. Like what we're trying to initially do in at least all of these collections that we're doing for Gold Master Series are like the 30 or 40 years ago. That's the stuff that's disappearing, right? And also, the people who used to work at these places and work on those games are passing away. Like even during the development of Atari 50, people who worked at Atari passed away, and we were very sad because we didn't get a chance to talk with them, right? So that history and that intimate knowledge of stuff is fading away. There's so many different things that you can sort of, we'd love to do collections on, but something like Clay Fighters, like you can easily get that and find out, and you could easily put together the context behind it. It's not super relevant to or culturally relevant to a lot of things. It's a cool thing to have in a collection for sure, no doubt, but no one's going to be going out there and wanting to know like what the intricacies of like the development process was for Clay Fighters, right? Huh? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always significance too, but then like you'd say like, well, I'd rather do a small sort of story about Primal Rage because that is, you have a second game that didn't really get released and the whole story behind that, the intricate process of development, the challenges that team went through to create that. So yes, I mean, to answer your question, there's always a story to tell about specific things, but there's probably if you were to give me Clay Fighters or Primal Rage, I would do Primal Rage in an instant because that story there is way more engaging, and there's also the story of the second game that is sort of not completed, right, and the whole story around that, right, but you can't tell the story about everything, so we have to be sort of selective in it. But whenever there's something that has an interesting story to tell, we definitely want to pursue it. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. We exactly, and that's a challenge we always have. Like Minter wasn't like Jordan, where he wrote down everything. We go and we interview people, and we go dig up stuff, and we find like, oh, this guy worked as an artist for some of the covers for Jeff, and so we asked him to see if he had anything. So it's a lot of time-consuming research. Oftentimes, you look for people who worked with these people or at these companies and no longer work there, and if they have anything. And we work really hard at this because there's a lot of instances where things could have disappeared. This is a side tangent, but like we did a Samurai Showdown collection some years ago, and we flew to Japan to interview members of the original Samurai Showdown teams. And during the discussion, and it's because we know and we pay attention to stuff, during the discussion there was this casual reference of a Neo Geo Samurai Showdown game that we had never heard of. And didn't assume to be existed. And he said, oh yeah, there's this last Neo Geo game. It was this version of Samurai Showdown that we never finished. It was on test for a day, and you know, I've got it on a hard drive and blah, blah, blah. And he kept going. And we're like, wait, what? And it finds Samurai Showdown Perfect, V Perfect is the game that came out of that. And it was a game that no one, because they're all new people at Neo Geo and SNK, excuse me, and they never knew about that game. It literally was on test for one day in Japan and disappeared. This guy hadn't, so we managed to negotiate and get it from him and restore the English storyline and fix it and then release it. And then eventually SNK made it an official Neo Geo cart. But the first appearance of that game ever is in our Samurai Showdown collection. And so that's why this sort of archaeological exploration is so important, and why we need to talk to these people, because there's so many cases where people just kind of go off and they have it on a hard drive and they don't think there's any significance to it until the right people are in the right place at the right time. And that happens far more than you would think. But it also scares me because think about all the other times that we weren't there for that, and something has disappeared or is somewhere that we're not aware of, right? So that's that's the stuff that kind of keeps me up at night. But to answer your question, we really spend a ton of time going out and digging and scouring and talking to people and things like that. There was we did an SNK 40th collection a long time ago, and we had to find this one guy who had this one board for this arcade game pre-Neo Geo that there are hardly any that exist, and we had to convince him to send it to us because up until that point, it was one of the first digitized samples, digital audio games on arcades, and the samples had never been right, and so we wanted to get that perfectly, and so we had to convince him to send it to us, which is crazy since there really aren't that many boards of that. But he trusted us, and he sent it, and we sampled it, and now that is the one accurate representation of that arcade game, right? So it's just a lot of work. It's a lot of tedious work, and we go everywhere we can and look up every person that we can to try to tell that story. But it's hard. It's hard. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff is just basically thrown out, or they're like, oh, well, I had this back when I worked at Nintendo, and I think that's where the Mario costume.
Yeah. Oh, I am very much aware of that because I worked at Sega for almost 10 years, and at the tail end of Sega, when they were moving to Southern California, they didn't want to take a lot of stuff, so they just kept putting out stuff for people to take. I took a lot because I knew the importance of it, but I felt bad about taking too much. But I should have, because I'm sure a lot of it got thrown away. I managed to grab like style guides for early Sonic, Eternal Champions, things like that would have just been thrown away. So it is, there's always going to be that situation, and it sucks, which is why like also the Video Game History Foundation that we work with, oftentimes when companies shut down or they're getting to that point, some people are smart enough to say, hey, do you want to come here and look through the stuff and see if there's anything important or relevant? So I think people are getting a little bit smarter about that, but certainly not in the early days, right? They just threw it away. They didn't care. So, yep. Cool. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there was a specs and sort of understanding of how that system worked. It went to prototype, but it never got released publicly. So we had an understanding of it, and we work with some very talented engineers who can sort of look at this stuff and replicate certain chips and things like that. And so we really wanted to get it because it's a part of video game history that most people don't know about. And also because Jeff Minter had a prototype, and it's actually a very pretty game, very colorful. It's almost like a Atari Lynx game in some ways, but a very, very pretty, very cool prototype game. We wanted to work with it. So, but we do that a lot. We investigate defunct hardware all the time and things like that. Just sometimes, unfortunately, if it doesn't always work, it may be cost prohibitive to try to spend a ton of time to emulate like something for a prototype, right? Or it can be very challenging because there's not enough data. But if we can scour and find enough information about the actual hardware and the chips that it's used and stuff like that, then oftentimes we can try to replicate it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's true. Yeah, but he never got to that point. So like his is pretty straightforward prototype. He was going to involve the other stuff more a little bit. But because it was a prototype and he was just trying to show that if there was interest in doing it, it's more playable with just a controller kind of situation. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys worked on the company worked on this Game Boy Advance game called X-Men Reign of Apocalypse.
Mm-hmm. Oh, back in the day, yeah.
Back in the day. How does a developer get somebody like you guys to work on something like that, like an Activision, EA?
People reach out to us all the time. We have a very good relationship with a lot of companies, and we have a lot of trust with, even first parties. Like we do some weird stuff that most people don't think about. Like we ported Minecraft to the 3DS, the 2DS, and the reason we did is because Microsoft and Mojang didn't think it was possible. And you can Microsoft, you know how large Microsoft is. They didn't think it was even possible to do. But we did it because our teams are very smart and we're very focused and stuff. And so there's Minecraft on the 3DS. But we've developed a lot of wonderful relations like that and testing stuff. Like we're very tech savvy and we're very ready to experiment, and we can do weird stuff. Like another example is Microsoft had this now defunct competition to Twitch. It was called Mixer. It was a streaming service. But what was different about Mixer is that it had an underlying layer where you could send data packets. And so what we ended up doing in this weird way is we built this physical table with tanks that had cameras on them, and you could play tank ball like a soccer game in real life. And we had announcers and color commentary with cameras, and people could log in like you would like a Twitch stream with a controller, and you could get in the queue, and then you could play live, which is crazy. Really think about it. And the table was in our studio in Emeryville. And Microsoft came to us because they're like, well, you guys can build the tanks and you can do it. So we do like a lot of weird scrappy stuff like that. But in relation back to your question, people contact us all the time. You know, we're one of the few people left who does emulation or can capture sort of the core essence of that style of gameplay and that era of gameplay, or even do things like we ported Dragon's Lair to the Game Boy Color, which people thought was crazy, but it actually is kind of an amazing version of Dragon's Lair. But people reach us all the time, ask us to do stuff, and it's more about like, is it, like I said, an interesting story to tell, right? Is there something great, or does it appeal to a large enough audience that it makes sense to do, right? So, but we get hit up all the time, constantly. Yeah. Yeah.
So you said you guys, your company worked on like a Game Boy Advance game. So do you guys have like the design documents, the prototypes, like that in like hard drive vaults?
Oh yeah, for a lot of that stuff we do because we worked on. We have project archives, so a lot of that stuff, the source code for all that stuff and things like that, we do keep. And obviously, in some cases, when we're doing port work, companies give us the source code for the original like arcade version and things like that. So we try to keep that for sure, because surprisingly, oftentimes people now come back to us because they want to do like something similar or something, and going back to that old archive, we can remember a lot and learn a lot from it. So yeah, we do try to keep all that stuff. Ideally, what we do is per project, we have a standalone computer that is that project, right? It represents that project, and that it's like a frozen capsule of that time with the SDKs and everything like that. Yeah. So yeah. Anything else? Cool. Well, thank you for joining. Appreciate it. And thanks for, like I said, coming out on your Sunday and having a chat with me about this for sure. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know how to spell the second dude you were talking about, Jeff?
Minter? It's a Minter.